I was never the kind of woman who dreamed about grand things. Not castles, not pearls, not Paris. I only wanted to make my own decisions. Where to live, who to love, what to keep, and what to let go. It sounds so small when you say it out loud. Choices. But small things are the first to be taken from you. The big ones fall later, like rotten fruit. I grew up in a one-street town that didn't even have a name worth remembering. Dust in the summer, mud in the winter. My father worked when he could and drank when he couldn't. My mother, well, she lived in a kind of silence that filled the house like fog. She didn't argue, she didn't protest, she just complied. Watching her was like watching a candle burn down, a slow, quiet surrender. I swore I'd never be like her, but life has a way of bending you, bit by bit, until one day you look in the mirror and see your mother's eyes looking back. I was 20 when I married Paul. He wasn't my first love, just the first man who seemed solid enough to stand against the wind. He talked big, laughed loud, and had that restless energy that made you think he'd break the world open for you. In the beginning, he let me believe I mattered, that my thoughts, my preferences, my little stubborn ways were worth something. But the first choice he took was my job. "Why should my wife have to work?" he said, as if it was some kind of gift. I'd been working in a small library since high school, and I loved it. The smell of paper, the quiet order of it. I told him so. He smiled, kissed my forehead, and said, "We'll have better things for you to do." The second choice was friends. He didn't like Jenny, too opinionated. Didn't like Mark from the library. I don't trust that one. Bit by bit, my phone calls went unanswered, my coffee dates canceled, until the only people I saw were the ones Paul approved of. And somehow, they all thought exactly like him. The third choice was where we lived. I wanted the little apartment near the park. He wanted his cousin's old place, miles from anywhere, so we can have privacy. I told him I liked being close to the city, to people. He told me I was being dramatic. We moved into the cousin's place. After that, it got harder to track what was mine and what wasn't. I don't remember the exact day I realized I wasn't living my life anymore, but I do remember the feeling, like standing in a room with the windows nailed shut, breathing air that had already been breathed too many times. I learned to go quiet, just like my mother. I told myself it was easier that way, less trouble, less arguing. But inside, a part of me was cataloging everything, every choice taken, every moment stolen, like I was keeping a ledger, though I didn't yet know why. Then came the day that shifted everything. It wasn't a big fight. It wasn't violence. It was something smaller, pettier, the kind of thing other people might laugh about. But for me, it was the crack in the wall. We'd been invited to a dinner party at his boss's house. I had nothing to wear but my old navy dress. I told Paul I'd like to buy something new, just something simple, something mine. He didn't even look at me. "You'll wear the navy one," he said. "You look fine in it." It wasn't the dress. It was the way he said it. Final, flat, as though my wanting didn't even exist. That night, I stared at my reflection in that navy dress, and I saw my mother again, the same eyes, the same surrender, and I realized I wasn't afraid of Paul. I was afraid of disappearing entirely. That was the night I decided I was going to take my choices back. I just didn't know yet how long it would take, or how much I'd have to lose first. At first, my rebellion was invisible. It had to be. You don't march into a fortress with a battering ram, not when you've been trapped inside it for years. You look for cracks. You test the mortar. The ledger I'd been keeping in my head became something real. I bought a cheap spiral notebook when Paul was away on a business trip. I kept it hidden inside an old sewing box my mother had given me. The notebook wasn't for poetry or lists. It was for evidence. Every time Paul made a decision for me, without asking, without even considering, I wrote it down. The date, the words he used, the way it made me feel. I wrote about the dinner dress, about the job I'd lost, about the friends I no longer saw, about the day he traded in my old blue car for the beige one he liked because it looked respectable. It might sound pathetic, keeping a diary of defeats, but it wasn't for self-pity. It was my map, because somewhere deep down I knew if I could trace the shape of my prison, I could start looking for the door. The first time I acted, it was small, laughably small. Paul told me to make spaghetti for dinner. He'd already bought the ingredients. But while he was at work, I made chicken soup instead. He came home, saw it on the table, and frowned. "I thought I told you. I felt like soup," I said, meeting his eyes. I saw it then, that flicker. Not rage, not fear, just confusion, like a man who'd found a loose floorboard in his own house. He didn't push it, but the next day he forgot to tell me where he'd be just so I couldn't plan dinner. A counter move, a warning. It became a quiet war. Every tiny decision I made without his permission felt like a stolen coin dropped into a jar. Reading books he wouldn't approve of, taking walks without telling him, buying a blouse I liked and hiding it in the back of the closet. But the turning point came from someone I least expected, his sister, Lorna. Lorna had never liked me much. She saw me as too quiet, too soft. But one afternoon, when Paul sent me to her house to pick up some old family photographs, she stopped me at the door. "You don't look happy," she said. It was such a simple sentence, but it hit me like a match to dry grass. I wanted to say, "I'm fine," like I always did, but something in her tone made me stop. "I'm not," I admitted. My voice came out so low I wasn't sure she heard me. She studied me for a long time before she handed me an envelope. Inside was cash, not much, maybe a couple of $100. "You didn't get this from me," she said. I didn't ask why she was doing it. I didn't want to break whatever fragile understanding had just formed between us. But when I left her house, the envelope felt heavier than gold. For the first time in years, I had money that Paul didn't know about. I hid it inside my notebook. Between the written records of all my stolen choices, I now had something that could buy me one small future choice. I didn't know what it would be yet. A train ticket, a lawyer, maybe just a lock on a door, but it was mine. From that day on, I started skimming tiny amounts from grocery money, from change he tossed onto the counter, from gifts I was allowed to buy for myself. The jar in my mind was real now, and it was filling. And here's the strange thing about having even the smallest measure of power. Once you taste it, you can't go back to being hungry. But Paul was starting to notice, not the money, not yet, but the fact that I didn't seem quite as pliable. He began asking more questions about where I went, who I spoke to, what I thought about things. There was a tightness in his voice I hadn't heard before. The fortress felt different, like the guards were awake now. It's funny how quickly a man like Paul can turn from casual dictator to watchman the moment he senses change. Before, his control was like air pressure, invisible, constant. Now it was like heat, focused, searching. The first sign came one evening over dinner. I'd made roast chicken and served it with the blouse I'd bought in secret, the pale green one with the soft collar. It wasn't flashy. I'd even washed it a few times so it wouldn't look new. Still, Paul's eyes paused on it just a little too long. "Where'd that come from?" he asked, his tone flat. "Found it in the closet. Must have been there a while," I said, forcing myself to take another bite of potatoes as if the conversation were nothing. He didn't argue. He didn't even scold. He just nodded, but I saw his mind working, not in suspicion yet, but in that slow, circling way a cat studies a mouse hole. The next day, he started showing up at home earlier than usual, sometimes just half an hour early, sometimes an entire afternoon. He'd pop into the kitchen to check on me or wander into the bedroom while I was folding laundry. No real reason, no real conversation, just presence. My little rebellions had made him restless. And then came the new rule. "We need to be smarter with money," he said one morning over coffee. "I'll do the grocery shopping from now on." It was almost laughable. He didn't cook. He didn't know the first thing about prices or brands, but I smiled and nodded. "If you want." Inside, I was already adjusting the plan. The cash from Lorna, the coins skimmed from change, it meant more now than it had yesterday. I couldn't grow the stash as easily, so I'd have to protect what I already had. I started hiding it in different places, rotating it every few days, between the pages of cookbooks, inside a zippered pillowcase, taped under the sewing box lid. It was a game of chess now, one I could not afford to lose. But money wasn't the only thing I was gathering. I began collecting small pieces of information, train schedules, addresses of shelters, names of lawyers scribbled on the back of grocery receipts. I'd read them, memorized them, then burn them in the sink. I told myself it was for someday, though I still wasn't sure if someday would ever come. And then Paul escalated again. One Friday night, we were at his boss's house for dinner. I sat across from Paul, watching him laugh too loudly at jokes that weren't funny, refilling his glass over and over. The men talked about politics, The women talked about vacation plans. I stayed quiet, smiling when required. On the way home, in the dark of the car, he said, "You didn't talk much tonight. Made me look bad." "I didn't know what to say," I replied carefully. "That's the problem," he said. His voice was calm, but it had that undercurrent I recognized, the kind that meant I'd be paying for this in some way. From now on, maybe I should do the talking for both of us. That night, lying in bed beside him, I stared at the ceiling and felt something shift. This wasn't just about money or friends or clothes anymore. This was about my right to speak. And if he took that, the rest would follow until there was nothing left of me but a shadow at his side. The next day, I broke one of my own rules. I reached out to someone, not Lorna. She was too close to him. Instead, I found the courage to call Jenny, my old friend from the library, the one I hadn't spoken to in years. I told her I just wanted to catch up, maybe have coffee. We met in a small cafe on the far side of town where Paul was unlikely to see me. Jenny had aged a few more lines around her eyes, her hair cut shorter, but when she smiled, it was like nothing had changed. We talked about books, about people we used to know. I didn't tell her everything, not yet, but when she asked if I was happy, I couldn't lie. "I'm trying to be," I said. She studied me, much like Lorna had, but there was a sharper edge to her gaze. "Trying isn't the same as being," she said softly. Then she slipped a business card across the table. "This is my cousin. She's a lawyer, just in case." I took it, my fingers curling around the small rectangle of paper like it was a lifeline. That night, Paul was in an unusually good mood, so I didn't push it. I just slipped the card into the sewing box under the notebook. My map was growing. My jar of stolen coins was waiting, but Paul's mood swings were getting harder to predict. 2 weeks later, he came home with a brand new phone for me. "Better security," he said. "This way, I can help you keep track of things." When I turned it on, I knew immediately it had tracking apps, maybe even a recording function. I didn't confront him. I just smiled and thanked him. Then I left the phone on the kitchen counter whenever I went for a walk, taking the old flip phone I'd hidden in the laundry room instead. The fortress wasn't just awake now. It was watching me from every angle. And I realized something important. I couldn't keep this war going forever. One day soon, I'd have to choose between staying and losing myself completely, or leaving, even if it meant walking out with nothing but the cash in my sewing box and the clothes on my back. I just didn't know yet which day that would be. When you live with someone like Paul, you learn to read the air before you open your eyes in the morning. That day, the air was heavy. He was already up, moving through the house with quick, deliberate steps. I heard drawers opening, the dull thud of cabinet doors. When I came into the kitchen, he was standing at the counter with my sewing box open in front of him. It took me a second to register what I was seeing. The box, the lid lifted, my notebook gone. "Looking for something?" I asked, keeping my voice light, though my chest was hammering. He didn't look at me. "What's this?" he asked, holding the notebook up like a dead rat. I walked over, took it from him before I could think better of it. It's private." "Private?" He laughed without humor. "From your husband?" "Yes," I said. The word surprised us both. Something flickered across his face then. Not rage, not yet, but something more dangerous. Calculation. He reached for the notebook again, but I stepped back. "Don't," I said. For a long moment, we just stood there. Then he smiled, that thin, tight smile I hated. "If you've got nothing to hide, you won't mind me reading it." I thought about the pages inside, dates, times, words he'd said, choices he'd stolen. I thought about the envelope of money tucked in a different hiding place. And I thought about how much of my plan depended on him not knowing I even had a plan. So I handed it to him. He flipped through it in silence. Every so often his eyes would flick up to mine, but I didn't look away. When he reached the last page, he shut it slowly and set it on the counter. "You've been keeping score," he said. "I have." "And what happens when you finish?" I shrugged. "I don't know." We didn't speak the rest of the day. But that night, when I lay in bed beside him, I knew the small war was over. The element of surprise was gone. If I stayed, the next move would be his, and it would be decisive. The very next morning, I called Jenny. I didn't ask if she was busy. I just said, "I need that lawyer's number." Her cousin's name was Rebecca Kane. She had a calm, steady voice, the kind that could make you believe you weren't walking into disaster. I didn't tell her everything, not yet, but I told her enough that I had no job, no separate bank account, no car in my name, that my husband kept track of where I went and what I did. "Do you have any cash?" she asked. "A little," I said. "Not much. Keep it hidden. And don't tell him you've spoken to me." She paused. "When you're ready, we'll make a plan. But once you start, you can't stop. Do you understand?" I did. And I hated how much that scared me. For the next week, I moved through the house like a ghost. I didn't challenge Paul. I didn't make soup when he wanted spaghetti. I wore the navy dress to his boss's dinner without a word. I let him believe the fight had gone out of me. But I was using that quiet to prepare. I packed a bag in my head, memorizing the exact things I'd take: my mother's silver locket, the cash, the old flip phone, one change of clothes. I mapped the route to the train station. I found out which day Paul's next overnight business trip was scheduled. And then something happened that nearly broke me. 3 days before he was supposed to leave, Paul told me he'd canceled the trip. "Too much going on at work," he said, but I knew better. He was closing the circle. That night, I sat in the bathroom with the shower running to cover the sound of my breathing. My hands shook as I pulled the envelope of cash from behind the loose tile under the sink. I counted it again, a little over $800 now. Enough for a bus ticket, a motel, and maybe a week of food. Not enough for safety. But safety was a luxury I couldn't afford to wait for. The next morning, I made the first irreversible move. While Paul was in the shower, I slipped into his office and opened his desk drawer. Inside, was his checkbook. I didn't take it. I just wrote down the account number and the bank branch. My hands were cold the whole time. Later that day, I went into town under the pretense of buying groceries. Instead, I went straight to the bank and opened a checking account in my name only. I didn't deposit anything yet. I couldn't risk a trail, but it was there, a small, legal space that belonged to me. That night, Paul watched me more closely than usual. "You seem quiet," he said. "I'm tired," I replied. It was true. Tired of pretending, tired of living in a house where the air was measured, where even my thoughts felt monitored. I knew now that my leaving wasn't about courage. It was about timing. And the timing was shrinking by the day. Because Paul had started locking the front door from the inside when he left for work. And when I asked for the key, he just smiled and said, "You don't need it." When Paul started locking the front door from the inside, something inside me shifted. It wasn't anger. Anger had burned itself out years ago. This was colder, sharper, the kind of stillness a deer has just before it bolts. For 3 days, I stayed inside while he was gone. I didn't want him to know that I could still leave through the back door if I really needed to. That was my one remaining advantage, and I kept it hidden like a secret weapon. But Paul wasn't a man who left advantages lying around for long. On the 4th morning, I came into the kitchen to find him holding my old flip phone. "Funny thing," he said. "I thought we threw this away." My heart thudded, but my face stayed still. "It's just a backup." "Backup for what?" he asked. He was smiling, but it wasn't the kind of smile meant for other people to see. "For calls you don't want me to know about?" I didn't answer. He set the phone on the table between us. "Here's the thing, sweetheart," he said, leaning in. "I don't like secrets, never have. And lately, you've been keeping a lot of them." I wanted to say 100 things. I wanted to tell him that secrets were the only thing keeping me alive. But I said nothing. Silence was safer. He stood, slid the phone into his pocket, and kissed the top of my head. "We'll talk more tonight." When he left for work, I knew he wasn't just suspicious now. He was certain, and certainty makes men like Paul dangerous. I didn't have until next week, or even the next day. I had hours. I went straight to the sewing box and pulled out the envelope of cash. Then I opened the closet and pulled the small duffel bag I'd hidden inside an old suitcase. It was the first time I'd actually put the escape into motion. The packing was fast, methodical. Locket, cash, toothbrush, one change of clothes. I left the rest, even the blouse I liked. Anything more would slow me down. When I was done, I sat at the kitchen table with the bag under my feet and waited for the clock to hit 11:15. The moment the bus to the next town left the station. From there, I could take a train anywhere. But Paul didn't go to work that day. At 10:05, I heard the front door open. My stomach turned cold. "Forgot my briefcase," he called. But when he came into the kitchen, he wasn't holding a briefcase. He was holding my notebook. "I've been thinking," he said, dropping it onto the table. "This thing, it's poison. You writing all this down, keeping it like some little diary, makes you think you're a victim." I didn't answer. My eyes flicked to the clock, 10:08. He picked up the notebook again, flipped to a random page, and read aloud one of the smaller entries. April 12th. Said no to dinner with Jenny. Said she's bad influence. He looked up at me. "Do you think you're clever keeping this?" "No," I said. "I think I'm honest." Something in his jaw tightened. For a second, I thought he might hit me, but instead, he just shook his head and walked toward the fireplace. I knew what he was going to do before he even struck the match. The flames took the notebook in seconds. I stood there, watching every page curl into black ash. I thought I would feel panic, but I didn't. Because the truth was, I didn't need the notebook anymore. The ledger wasn't on paper. It was in me. When the last scrap of it turned to cinder, Paul turned to me. "We're going to start fresh," he said. "No more writing, no more secrets." It was almost funny. The man had no idea that burning my notebook was the most freeing thing he could have done, because now there was nothing left for him to find. When he left again, this time for real, I didn't wait. I grabbed the duffel, slipped out the back door, and took the side street to the bus stop. I kept my head down, my pace steady. Not too fast, not too slow. Just another woman walking with a bag. I could hear the bus engine before I saw it. My pulse pounded so hard I could feel it in my fingertips, and then I heard his voice. "Maria!" It came from somewhere behind me. I didn't turn. If I turned, I'd stop. If I stopped, I'd never start again. I stepped onto the bus, handed the driver my cash, and slid into a seat near the back. The doors closed, the engine roared, and the town began to slip away through the window. But I knew Paul wasn't done. Men like him never are. The war wasn't over. It was just moving to a bigger battlefield. The bus rattled on for an hour before the town disappeared completely behind me. I didn't look back once, not at the streets I'd walked 1,000 times, not at the house where I'd spent more nights counting seconds than sleeping. The air smelled different already, not freer exactly, but unclaimed. I got off in a small city 2 towns over, where the train station was just 3 blocks from the bus stop. I bought a ticket to the coast. The clerk didn't even look at me twice. I was just another traveler with a bag and a tired face. On the train, I sat by the window, my duffel at my feet, my hand resting on the envelope of cash inside. I thought I'd feel relief. Instead, I felt suspended, like I'd stepped off a ledge and was still waiting to hit the ground. By the time the sun was setting, I was in a cheap motel room by the ocean. The air was damp with salt, and I could hear waves hitting the shore through the thin walls. I lay on the bed fully dressed, my shoes still on, and slept for 10 hours straight. When I woke, the phone on the nightstand was blinking. 2 missed calls from a number I didn't recognize. 1 voicemail. I listened. "Maria," Paul's voice filled the room, low and calm, the way it always was when he was most dangerous. "You've had your little moment." but we both know you can't make it out there. You need me. Call me back and we'll pretend this never happened." I deleted it without replaying. Over the next week, the calls kept coming, sometimes angry, sometimes pleading, sometimes pretending to be casual. I didn't answer any of them. Instead, I went to the bank, opened that account Rebecca had told me to make, and deposited the entire envelope of cash. My first deposit in my first account with my own name. Rebecca helped me file the paperwork to freeze our joint accounts. She moved quickly, and by the time Paul realized what was happening, the money he thought was entirely his had to be divided. Legally, fairly, for once I got my share. It wasn't much, but it was enough. I rented a tiny apartment above a laundromat, the kind of place where the walls were thin, but the windows faced the morning sun. I bought my own coffee maker, my own groceries. I chose every single thing that came through that door. Paul tried one more trick. A letter, handwritten, left at the building's mailbox without a return address. In it, he reminded me of the good times, hinted at how lonely he was now, promised he'd change. At the bottom, he wrote, "We were better together than apart." I didn't reply, but I didn't tear it up either. Instead, I folded it carefully, slid it into a new notebook, the kind with a thick red cover, and on the next page I wrote in my own hand, August 14th, said no, chose myself instead. That notebook wasn't for keeping score anymore. It was for keeping proof. Proof that I could live a life made of my own choices, even if they were small ones. Coffee instead of tea, a walk at midnight just because I wanted to, a pale green blouse hanging in the closet with the tag still on because I didn't need anyone's permission to wear it. Revenge, I learned, doesn't have to be a loud victory. Sometimes it's just the quiet fact of your absence in the life of someone who thought they owned you. Paul didn't take my calls anymore, but then again, I never made them. And in the end, the truest revenge was this. Every choice I make now is mine, every single one.